Yeah, hello there. Welcome to Hoojies Garage again. I'm at the Saab Museum and I'm going to talk about the decade of the 1980s in the Saab Museum today. I'm standing here next to a prototype of the 900 sedan version. Among the last things that happened in the end of the 1970s was that the Saab 900 was introduced, but only as a wagon back or combi coupe, as some call it. Now, the 1980s started with discontinuation or something, or ceasing or ending production. For instance, this is a weird one-off car, the Saab 98, but the Saab 96, which was the more conventional looking Saab 96 car, well, it was ended in 1980. The rally and competition department also closed in 1980, or if it was 81. So that was kind of end of an era, the Saab 96 type of car with the normal estate, the 95 also. That era started in the early 1950s and ended 1980. So new times were coming, and the Saab 900 lineup was developed over the years that came in the beginning of the 1980s. There was also a two-door sedan version launched at some point in time. But let me think now. And then, yes, of course, Saab introduced the performance control of the turbo engine. Automatic performance control then came in 82, I think it was. And that was much appreciated. You could run it on kind of any gasoline fuel available. And there were also interesting development going on under the bonnet or under the hood in a way. The 16-valve turbo came in 84, and that was quite something. I think I will get back to that if I find an engine standing here somewhere. Yeah, here we have them, the lineup of the powertrains used for the Saab 900. Initially in 79, this old B engine as it's called, but here it's an early turbo version in 8-valve setup, or yeah, exactly. Before the intercooler also. Then that engine was redefined or redesigned into the H version, as it's called. Also here in a 8-valve configuration, but with an intercooler, I can see. But it still keeps this kind of funny old Ricardo layout with the clutch in front. The driving direction is like this, and the clutch sits here, and you see the drive shafts at the back, and the engine sits on top of the gearbox. And in 1984, then this engine came, and I think it must have been one of the earliest, at least in terms of a mass production engine. I think the 16-valve was the very early design like that. Okay, they were engines with 16 valves already back in the 1920s, but I mean, for a modern and mass-produced engine, then this was quite some news, I would say. And it gave some 175 horsepower. That was quite something in those days. And a bit funny enough, the first model year in 84 had kind of the same gearing ratio as the previous year's car, but this one was quite a bit more powerful and torquey and so on. So they realized at Saab that if you stayed on fifth gear and gave it full throttle at 80 kilometers per hour, it accelerated up to 120 kilometers per hour quicker than a Ferrari Testarossa, also on fifth gear though. If you would have put in third on the Testarossa, then of course something different. But you could, they said in some ads somewhere that the Saab 900 is quicker than a Ferrari Testarossa. Well, to some degree it was true. All right. By the mid-1980s, Saab also launched this special version of the Saab 900, the Convertible. Nowadays one might think that, a convertible, all right, nice, but what's the big deal? But in those days, convertible cars weren't as, let's say, refined as this. It has a very good soft top, well insulated, and the car was not particularly noisy. And it was automatic. You just unlatched it and pushed a button and it was moved back or retracted with hydraulics. And the car is a full 4-seater, so it was received very well. And I must say that I think that the Saab 900 the Saab 900 convertible over the years has been, I think, even with international standards or in competition with the other brands, I think that the convertible of the Saab 900 has been the most sold 4-seater convertible of all brands. So in relative terms, it was a huge success for Saab, and the car was also made, or let's say like this, when the new generation of the 900 came, it was also made as a convertible, and Saab continued with that also for the 93. But this was the way it started, although I think it started one model year earlier, because this is an 87, and I think there are some model year 86 cars that have the more vertical nose or short nose or whatever you should call it. Anyway, here it is. Now, the big thing for Saab in the 1980s, that's that one, the Saab 9000. Let's take a closer look. Now, as Saab discontinued the Saab 96 in 1980, they started a little cooperation with Lancia in Italy, where they kind of rebadged a Lancia Delta and writing Saab Lancia 600 on it. And they started to sell those cars in Sweden, at least, for a few years in the beginning of the 1980s. Now, as far as I understand, they tried to upgrade it a little bit to be able to cope with the climate up here in Sweden. So that Saab Lancia 600 was kind of, well, I've driven one, it was nice to drive for its time and so on. But up here with salty roads and so on, the cars just disappeared. I mean, you can see Saab 96 cars and 99 cars from that area around there still. Okay, of course, some are beaten up quite a bit, but the Lancia Delta or Saab 600, they just disappeared. They corroded, and it's an extremely rare sight to see such a car up here today. What came first, I don't really know. Did Saab and Fiat Lancia start the cooperation already before the Saab 600? Maybe. I don't know exactly which year this development with the Saab 9000 started. Saab had tried to make a development, I think it was called X29 or something, before the Fiat Lancia cooperation, but Saab was never a company that made a lot of money. And developing a new car also in those times were very, very expensive. Lots of tooling, of course. Lots of development. So anyhow, in the early 80s, there was a board decision somehow between Saab Scania and the Fiat Group to develop a car jointly. It sounds easy in a way when you're on that level, but making two cars out of one design is not easy in reality. And Saab learned that the hard way, of course. The main concept of the car was apparently quite easy to agree upon. The old Ricardo design had to go. It was not very cost effective. It had some pros, but it also had a lot of cons. So this car then reverted back to the transverse layout, which of course meant that you could not have double A-arms for the suspension and so on. And those short A-arms that we see nowadays, they weren't kind of invented then. So the Saab engine was to be used for the Saab cars and a newly developed gearbox then. But the whole body structure were to be a common development. And of course, if you know the Fiat Croma, the Lancia, what was it called? Tema, I think it was. If you kind of cut the car here and cut the car here somewhere, then you see that it's the same car, of course. I'm not sure that the doors are exactly interchangeable, but they look the same. But different ambitions, different markets. Saab were to sell in the US, of course, and US had higher crash standards, and Saab internally also had high crash standards. Already in the 70s, there was some comparison made where someone dropped a 3 Series BMW with the roof down like that, and it just became flat. But if you made the same thing with the Saab, then the roof was okay, a bit dented, but the structure was intact. So there were different ambitions. I think I've heard something about a crash test on some early prototype car, and the Italians were super happy. The steering wheel hadn't moved more than whatever the European legislation dictated, and the Saab guys just, yeah, okay, the wheel isn't too bad, but the rest of the car is just crap. So, yeah, easy it was not. For sure not. And in terms of body stampings, I think it was just a handful parts that were really the same in the end, even though everything kind of, well, not everything, but a lot of things looked the same. Just the doors, these doors have thicker metal. The Italian doors are much thinner. Okay, they didn't think they needed anything better than that, and Saab had other objectives. Now, of course, the appearance of the car was also a bit, well, what do you say? Now the 900 next to it. Now this early 900 next to it, of course, has a bit of character, but the character is a bit destroyed by these American steel beams that they used on the early Saab 900 car, so it's quite an ugly face from that perspective. But the 9000 lacked a bit of character. And well, but there wasn't much to do about that really. Now, what really shines on this car is the interior. I think the interior is fantastic in this car. Still today, I really love this one. It's a space. It has lots of space, lots of comfort, and for its time, lots of modern technology in a way. Very cockpit-oriented dashboard and so on. So that's really something. The car was launched in 1984 as a model year 85 car. But the last time Saab designed a new car or a new product, let's say like that, was, well, what you consider to be a new car. Everything before that had kind of been an evolution from a new development in the 1960s. This was a completely new car. And even though there were shared developments made with Italy, just the whole manufacturing setup was kind of neglected in a way at Saab. The engineers, it was just like they thought that, okay, here we just hand over a car to the production guys and you just build it, but they weren't really prepared and they had never put a new product of this magnitude into production. So there were huge delays in the beginning, and lots of people were of course interested in buying the car, but there were no cars available. So that must have been a huge circus. Now, then of course there were lots of new engineers, and they didn't really have the background of how to have all the attention to detail in terms of manufacturing and also assembly methods as such. So the car ended up quite expensive to build, and warranty costs came creeping also, because, well, you know what it's like, something completely new. It's always difficult to prototype and test something that is really spot on. And you know, I would say all manufacturers that launch something completely new, they really struggle with the first model year. But it was probably a bit worse with this thing. I have heard a story about a customer, an early customer. He had taken delivery of his car, and then he wanted to do something with the ashtray. And as he pulled it out, he found that it was just a plug made out of wood. So quality control was, or let's say assembly control maybe wasn't all that good also. How that thing happened, I don't know, but well, weird things happen. Anyhow, the car, I drove a car just like this one back in 85, I think it was. And I must say that I was amazed by the performance and the handling and the whole driving experience of this thing. It was like coming to another world. It was like a spaceship that had landed. It was so much better than anything I had ever driven before. And some year later, I took a test drive in a Volvo 740 Turbo, some version, and I was amazed in the completely opposite direction. What kind of farming equipment is this? But still, Volvo outsold this car by far, because, well, yeah, making a good product is one thing, but selling a good product, that's another story. And Volvo knew how to sell cars. Saab were a bit behind. The rear end of the Saab 9000 was looking quite a bit different from the 900, although it kind of resembles the wagon back concept in a way, but it had a completely different, or let's say like this, the early cars had a completely different three-piece rear end spoiler, which was a bit of a nightmare to get everything to line up well. In just some odd year later, I think they took away those things and made another design of the spoiler. This first three-piece thing was just too complex, too expensive, just a lot of headache. But it has lots of space. If one would open this one up, I think it was considered to be a large car, although the exterior kind of is mid-sized. Yeah, and then upstairs you see another Saab 9000 that was used in some kind of competition or record event, one could say. Let's go up there and take a look. And here we have the Saab EV1, designed by Björn Envall, and the body is made out of steel by Leif Mellberg. And well, it's a one-off, a fully functional prototype car or concept car. It's even been playing a little role in the Back to the Future movie. Unfortunately, it never made it into production. Although in one way one could say that it could have, because everything in it is from the Saab 900 Turbo 16. So fully drivable, some 280 horsepower, and quite a quick car. And I've even seen Björn Envall driving this thing in the streets in Trollhättan. Up here we have the Saab 9000 Turbo. I would think it's model year 86 or something like that. I look at the spoiler. This was quite something. And it started with an idea of the powertrain manager in those days. Olle Granlund, I think it must have been. I think he had been at some show somewhere, some international car exposition, well, whatever you say. Like the IAA in Frankfurt or something like that. And he had seen that Mercedes had achieved some kind of record with, they had that 190 with a 2.3 liter Evo something, I think it was made for homologating something in racing or something like that. But when he saw the numbers that were presented by Mercedes, he thought that we can beat this. With the standard car, we can beat this. And he, by the way, it says model year 87, sorry. Anyhow, but the test was made in 86. Anyhow, he discussed this with other people at Saab and with managers for sure, the few other managers that were on top of him. And they decided to make some kind of an experiment where they, without any publicity, made an attempt to see if his theories really were correct. And they were, just finding a suitable track for driving kind of full throttle all the time. That was a bit of an adventure on its own, but they ended up in finding that in Alabama in the US, there's this Talladega kind of NASCAR raceway something. And they went there and made measurements and tried out things to see if standard tires would withstand going full throttle all the time, because they wanted to beat 100,000 kilometer record. Yeah, a 100,000 kilometer record. So the ambitions were high, and making that at full speed, that takes several weeks. I don't know if there's a date set here somewhere. Anyhow, it takes weeks to beat that. But the first evaluation went well, and based from data of all that, they made calculations and realized that, okay, we have to have this much fuel and these many tires, and then there were certain international rules on how to prepare the car. The car had to be standard. I think there were people from FIA at the assembly line kind of making sure that you couldn't tweak the car in any way. And you were allowed to bring a certain amount of spare parts in kilos somehow, based on the weight of the car, I think. And they were allowed to put in a rollover cage and 4 or 6 point safety harness and so on. They have these funny lamps that, because you had to get into the pits in the middle of the night, and then there were some identification lamps and things like that. But they made all the planning, and as you can see, they got sponsorship for the tires. Not bad. Shell. This car is a car before catalytic converters. They were not mandatory in Europe, and they had a little bit higher output on the European spec car. So Shell said that, okay, we will make European fuel for you in the US. Just that thing. So they made a batch in some refinery, whatever you call it, over in the US for this event. And they had lots of people driving the cars like if it was Le Mans, but for weeks instead of 24 hours. In the end, they made it, as you can see. And they also made lots of records. They started, clocking things already from at 10 kilometers and so on. And the 1 hour speed average was the highest, then 220, but 213 kilometers per hour, including everything. And they also got into a bit of problem, of course. Well, maybe not of course, but they ended up with some problems. Fuel starvation. They had not really understood when to start to refuel, and the fuel supply just didn't end like that abruptly. So the engines started to run a bit lean before they pitted and refueled, and that damaged something because the exhaust temperatures went up and they got damages. So if they would have known that a bit better, I don't think they would have had to touch anything. But they did change some engine parts. I think they changed the whole cylinder head just to be on the safe side, and the turbo. Garrett weren't so happy with that, because they would like to have been able to show that the turbo easily would have lasted that long, and I think it would have, but that's life. And after all that time, they managed, because these spare parts they were thinking that yes, things can go wrong, so they had an extra turbo and an extra cylinder head and other parts in the car. I think they were even allowed to have extra windscreens, but they did not have to be in the car as they were racing or whichever way did they? Yeah, they must have been driving that way. Different in the US. Oh, anyhow, what else? Well, yeah. Why would you need a new windscreen? If you look over here, if you look here at the front end of the car, I don't know if there's lots of sand or something outside of the racetrack, but on the racetrack there were only 3 cars, of course, those 3 Saab 9000 cars that were used for this record event. But the headlamps are extremely sandblasted. They are completely dull. So is the front end of this side turn indicator, and the paint has been chipped a bit, and the grille has lots of sandblasting on it, and even the windscreen has been beaten quite badly, I must say. And this funny thing here is for a quick service of the engine. They must have replaced the oil a couple of times also, of course. Anyhow, this was quite an achievement, I must say. So, yeah, something to be proud of. Ah, by the way, there was even an SAE paper. So if you really want to get into the details of this event, you can probably find an SAE paper written by Ole Granlund from, well, whenever then, late 1986 or maybe early 1987. Reading that paper is quite an interesting thing to do if you're into these kind of things. From what I've been able to see here in the museum, there aren't all that many Saab 9000 cars here. There is that early production car. There's of course the Talladega record-beating car. I can see one dark blue sedan. The 9000 came as a sedan version also in '88 or something. And there is another Saab 9000, the CS Aero, but that's from the 1990s, so that's not part of the 1980s chapter. I know that somewhere where they aren't, well, they have more cars than what's on display, of course, and in there's, for instance, a car that the board director of the board somewhere high up in the organization, Sam Wallenberg something, his company car from the mid-80s is there. And it has one interesting little feature. It has a cell phone. Well, what's the big deal? But that must have been in 1985 or 86. So it was not really a cell phone. It was a old-fashioned telephone thing, whatever you call this, lure. And there was some kind of transmitter. So he just dialed one number because there was only one number to dial. And he ended up at the switchboard of the big bank that he owned. And then the receptionist at the switchboard connected him to whoever he wanted to be connected with. So in a way, it was a cell phone. Yeah, I almost forgot the 1980s. Of course, it also meant the discontinuation of the Saab 99. The Saab 99 was kind of merged with the rear end of a 2-door Saab 900 called the Saab 90, but I don't know if that one was sold abroad or not. So there, I would say that that's the last Saab 99 as most people know it. And I think the last model year was in 1984. Well, then as we approached the end of the 1980s, there wasn't all that much happening with the cars. There were always small refinements going on in the typical small car manufacturer fashion. But the Saab 9000 had generated good profits for a few years. But then reality hit Saab. Warranty costs were skyrocketing. I think that the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Swedish crown got unfavorable. So by, I don't know exactly when, 88 or something like that, the losses were huge. So there were a few good years in the middle of the 80s, but then things just went like that. Car fleet were too complex to build, expensive to build, high warranty costs, sales, boosting sales even more. There was not the skill to achieve that. Just as simple as that. And this meant that, well, you can't live on the current products forever. So there was, for instance, the project 102, it was called. It was meant to be a Saab 900 replacement of the 900 as it was done in the end of the 80s, but based on the Saab 9000 platform. I think that project could have been really something if they, because I've seen some sketch from somewhere, or if it's a photo of a model or something, and the car looked better than the 9000 from my subjective opinion, and let's say the concept of the 9000 as such was a really good car if they just had gotten the quality on par with what expectations were in those days. Now the 102 never really took off because, well, first of all, there wasn't just enough money internally or within the Saab Scania group to finance that thing, and to achieve that, well, continuing with the Fiat Lancia way, it hadn't been that successful in many persons' opinion. And then what to do? The whole kind of engineering side of the car division worked on a solution. Somehow they had made contact with Mazda, and there was a Mazda 626 about to be launched in that era. But well, let's say like this: there was even a Mazda 626 converted into a Saabish kind of Saab 900 in Trollhättan, but it was not made within the factory area. So the history repeats itself. It was made in a private garage somewhere where a powertrain from a Saab was put into a Mazda 626. And there were quite some good ideas on how to get that product to fly or to be a good car. But then it was the absolute top management that met with Mazda, absolute top management, and they were not really thinking in the same way, and somehow the top management reaction was that no, this is not something that we should continue with. I think that was a mistake, but that's life sometimes. As that idea ended, what to do then? There was talk with Ford. Both Ford and GM were interested in expanding their portfolio, or whatever you would say. Then Ford investigated the situation at Saab in depth. Really a good, what do you call it? Due diligence, or whatever you call it. At the same time, in parallel, there was still some Fiat Lancia interest, because Fiat understood that Saab is going to be bankrupt, so maybe we can make a good deal one way or the other, But Saab were a bit, they weren't that bemused by cooperating with Fiat Lancia again. But then things happened. Now this must have been the autumn in '89, I think it was. Ford suddenly understood that GM were interested in buying Jaguar, and I don't know if Jaguar then were linked to something else in the British automotive industry, but Jaguar. GM was interested in buying Jaguar, and they were doing some kind of due diligence there. Now, Ford had seen that the financial books of Saab were absolute crap. The car company would not survive very, very long, and getting into a deal with Saab would have meant a lot of money going that way, just to trying to get Saab on its feet again. But when Ford understood that there was something going on between Jaguar and GM, they suddenly kind of stole Jaguar from GM without doing any careful analysis of the situation of the company that GM had done, and GM had understood that Jaguar was also a company that was about to enter a financial disaster in a way. So suddenly things just swapped. Ford bought Jaguar, GM bought Saab, and none of the companies really knew what they were doing. Well. So at the very last thing that happened for Saab at the end of the 1980 decade was that GM was announced as a new 50% owner of the Saab car division. So let's get into the 1990s soon then. That's all for this chapter. Take care. Bye-bye.